Name the most successful CEO in American business history. Chances are you pictured a household name, a face on magazine covers. Here's what's strange. The research says you're almost certainly wrong. The people who built the most successful companies in modern history were quiet, humble, complete strangers to you right now. Today I'll show you why and what it means for anyone trying to build something great. In 1996, a man named Jim Collins was having dinner with a group of thought leaders in San Francisco. The conversation was about what makes companies perform, and the managing director of McKinsey's San Francisco office leaned over to Collins and said something that would change the course of his life. "You know, Jim, we love your book, Built to Last. You and your co-author did a very fine job. Unfortunately, it's useless." Collins naturally asked him to explain. "The companies you wrote about were always great. They had founders like David Packard and George Merck who shaped greatness from the very beginning. But what about the vast majority of companies that wake up partway through life and realize that they're good but not great?" That question planted a seed, and 5 years later, Collins emerged from what he called monk mode with the answer. He'd assembled a team of 21 researchers. They read nearly 6,000 articles. They generated over 2,000 pages of interview transcripts. 10.5 people years of effort. They started with every Fortune 500 company that had ever existed over a 30-year period. 1,435 candidates. They sifted, they tested, they argued, and in the end, only 11 companies met their criteria. 11 companies that had taken themselves from average performance to spectacular performance, and then sustained that performance for at least 15 years. If you'd invested $1 in those 11 companies in 1965 and held until the start of the year 2000, that single dollar would have multiplied 471 times. 471 times. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through every key idea from this study. Why the leaders nobody had heard of crushed the celebrity CEOs. Why people are your most important asset is dead wrong. Why an admiral tortured for 8 years in a Vietnamese prison camp holds the secret to corporate transformation. And why the most powerful idea in this entire book is, paradoxically, the simplest one ever discovered. Welcome to Good to Great by Jim Collins. Chapter 1. Level 5 Leadership. In 1971, a quiet, mild-mannered man named Darwin Smith became the chief executive of Kimberly-Clark. Kimberly-Clark at the time was a stodgy old paper company whose stock had fallen 36% behind the general market over the previous 20 years. A board member pulled Smith aside and reminded him that he lacked some of the qualifications for the position. Smith himself wasn't sure they'd made the right choice, but CEO he was, and CEO he remained for the next 20 years. Now, before I tell you what Darwin Smith did, you need to picture him, because if you walked past him on the street, you would not look twice. He'd grown up as a poor Indiana farm town boy. He put himself through college by working the day shift at International Harvester and attending Indiana University at night. One day on the factory floor, he lost part of a finger. The story goes that he went to class that evening and returned to work the next morning. He kept working full-time. He kept going to class at night, and somehow he earned admission to Harvard Law School. 2 months after becoming CEO, doctors diagnosed him with nose and throat cancer. They gave him less than a year to live. Smith informed the board, then made it clear he was not dead yet and had no plans to die anytime soon. He kept his full work schedule. He commuted weekly from Wisconsin to Houston for radiation therapy, and he lived 25 more years, most of them as CEO. When a journalist asked him to describe his management style, Smith, dressed unfashionably like a farm boy, wearing his first suit bought at JCPenney, just stared back from behind his nerdy black-rimmed glasses. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he said simply, "Eccentric." That was Darwin Smith, a man who in his spare time found his favorite companionship among plumbers and electricians. and spent his vacations rumbling around his Wisconsin farm in the cab of a backhoe, digging holes and moving rocks. So what did this seemingly ordinary man do? He made the most dramatic decision in the history of his company. He sold the mills, the paper mills, the traditional core business that Kimberly-Clark had been built on for over a century, including the mill in Kimberly, Wisconsin, the town the company was literally named after. Smith and his team had concluded that the coated paper business was doomed to mediocrity. The economics were terrible, but if Kimberly-Clark threw itself into the fire of the consumer paper products industry, where world-class competition like Procter & Gamble would force them to either achieve greatness or perish, they had a shot. So like a general burning his boats upon landing, leaving only one option, succeed or die, Smith sold the mills and threw everything into consumer brands like Huggies and Kleenex. The business media called it stupid. Wall Street analysts downgraded the stock. Smith never wavered. 25 years later, Kimberly-Clark owned Scott Paper outright. They beat Procter & Gamble in 6 of 8 product categories. Under Smith's leadership, the company generated returns more than 4 times the general market, outperforming the giants: Coca-Cola, Hewlett-Packard, 3M, General Electric. When Smith reflected on this in retirement, he said simply, "I never stopped trying to become qualified for the job." Here's the thing about Darwin Smith. He's not famous. The Wall Street Journal never wrote a splashy feature on him. You've probably never heard his name. And that turns out to be the entire point, because what Jim Collins and his team found, and they did not expect this, was that every single one of the 11 companies that made the leap from good to great was led at the pivotal moment of transition by a leader exactly like Darwin Smith. Quiet, humble, self-effacing, almost invisible. The researchers called them level 5 leaders. And what makes a level 5 leader is not what you'd expect. It's a paradoxical blend of 2 qualities that almost never appear together in the same person: extreme personal humility and intense professional will. Think about that for a moment. Humble, but ferociously driven. Self-effacing, but absolutely relentless. Modest about themselves, but ruthlessly ambitious for what they're building. Consider another one of them. Coleman Mockler became CEO of Gillette in 1975. During his tenure, Gillette faced 3 separate attacks that threatened to destroy the company. 2 were hostile takeover bids from Ronald Perelman, a cigar-chomping corporate raider with a reputation for breaking apart companies. The 3rd was from an investment group that bought up shares and launched a proxy battle, hoping to sell the company to the highest bidder and pocket a quick gain. If Mockler had simply accepted Perelman's offer, the shareholders would have made a 44% instant profit on their stock. Mockler personally would have walked away with millions. Most executives would have capitulated. Coleman Mockler did not capitulate. A quiet, courteous, almost patrician man, Mockler organized his senior executives to reach out to thousands of individual shareholders. Person by person, phone call by phone call, they won the battle. Now here's where it gets interesting. Was Mockler just protecting his job? No, because while all this was happening, Mockler and his team were quietly investing huge amounts of money in radically new shaving technology. Technology so secret, it was developed under armed guard, technology that would later become the Sensor and the Mach 3. Had Perelman taken over, those projects would have been killed. Hundreds of millions of people would have woken up to a more painful daily battle with stubble. If a shareholder had taken Perelman's 44% premium and invested the proceeds in the general market for the next 10 years, that shareholder would have ended up 3 times worse off than someone who simply stayed with Mockler. Mockler was proven right, stunningly so, but he never got to enjoy it. On January 25th, 1991, the Gillette team received an advance copy of the cover of Forbes magazine. It featured an artist rendition of Mockler standing atop a mountain, holding a giant razor above his head in a triumphant pose, while his vanquished enemies languished on the hillsides below. The publicity-shy Mockler had likely declined to be photographed for the cover in the first place. His colleagues teased him, calling him a corporate Conan the Triumphant. Walking back to his office, minutes after seeing this public acknowledgement of 16 years of struggle, Coleman Mockler crumpled to the floor, struck dead, a massive heart attack. He had given everything he had to that company, not because of what he'd get, but because he simply could not imagine doing it any other way. Now contrast Darwin Smith and Coleman Mockler with the leaders of the comparison companies, the companies that were nearly identical at the time of transition, but never made the leap. Take Scott Paper, Kimberly-Clark's direct competitor. Scott hired a man named Al Dunlap as CEO. Dunlap loudly beat on his own chest, telling anyone who would listen, and many who would prefer not to, about his accomplishments. He once boasted that the Scott story would, quote, go down in the annals of American business history as one of the most successful, quickest turnarounds ever. In 603 days at Scott Paper, Dunlap personally accrued $100 million. That's $165,000 per day. How? Largely by slashing the workforce, cutting research in half, and putting the company on growth steroids, preparing it not for greatness, but for sale. After he sold off the company and pocketed his millions, Dunlap wrote a book about himself. In it, he proudly trumpeted his nickname, Rambo, in pinstripes. I'm picturing Darwin Smith watching a Rambo movie with his wife, and I'm fairly certain he never walked out of the theater saying, you know, I really relate to this Rambo character. He reminds me of me. In over 2/3 of the comparison companies, the ones that failed to become great, the researchers found exactly this pattern: a gargantuan personal ego at the top, a leader who was the show, a leader who by his very presence was the company. And here's the thing, sometimes these leaders produced spectacular short-term results. Lee Iacocca saved Chrysler from the brink of bankruptcy, one of the most celebrated turnarounds in American business history. But then Iacocca got famous. He appeared on talk shows. He starred in commercials. He entertained the idea of running for president. He got distracted by his own celebrity. During the second half of his tenure, Chrysler fell 31% behind the market and faced another potential bankruptcy. As one of his own executives wrote, like so many patients with a heart condition, we'd survived surgery several years before, only to revert to our unhealthy lifestyle. This is the pattern Collins found over and over. The charismatic celebrity CEO produces a spectacular rise. Then, when he steps away or gets distracted, the entire thing collapses. Because the company was never built on greatness, it was built on him. But level 5 leaders are different in a very specific way. They are profoundly ambitious, but their ambition is not for themselves, it is for the company. They want the institution to be great, long after they're gone. Consider David Maxwell at Fannie Mae. When Maxwell took over in 1981, the company was losing $1 million every single business day. Over the next 9 years, he transformed it into a high-performance machine that rivaled the best Wall Street firms, earning $4 million every business day. When he retired, his retirement package had grown to be worth $20 million. This became a controversy in Congress, since Fannie Mae operates under a government charter. Maxwell's response? He wrote a letter to his successor, instructing him not to pay the remaining $5.5 million of his package, and asked that the entire amount be contributed to the Fannie Mae Foundation for Low-Income Housing. $5.5 million given away. The researchers called this the window and the mirror. When things go well at the company, the level 5 leader looks out the window. He gives credit to factors outside himself: good colleagues, good fortune, great timing. When things go poorly, he looks in the mirror, he blames himself, takes the responsibility. The comparison leaders did the exact opposite. When things went well, they looked in the mirror, they preened, they claimed the credit. When things went poorly, They looked out the window. They blamed the economy, the competition, the unions, the market, anything but themselves. Alan Wurtzel, the CEO who built Circuit City into a company that beat the stock market by 22 times over 15 years, was asked to list the top 5 factors in his company's transformation. Number 1 on his list was luck, just luck. When the researchers pushed back, Wurtzel just smiled. He preferred to attribute his success to being in the right place at the right time. Later, asked about the enduring nature of the transformation, he said simply, "The first thing that comes to mind is luck. I was lucky to find the right successor." Joseph Coleman, the transition CEO of Philip Morris, refused to take credit for his company's success at all. He even wrote a book about his career, which he reluctantly published only at the urging of his colleagues. The title of the book, "I'm a Lucky Guy." These were the people running some of the most successful companies of the 20th century, and they thought they were just lucky. That is level 5 leadership. The paradox of fierce will and deep humility. The ambition that points outward, not inward. The plow horse, not the show horse. And here's the most important question of all. Can you learn to become level 5? Collins's honest answer was, "I don't know." He suspected that there are 2 kinds of people in the world. Those who could never, in a million years, bring themselves to subjugate their egoistic needs to something larger than themselves, and those who have the capacity, perhaps buried, perhaps ignored, but then nonetheless. For these second people, and Collins believed they were the majority, level 5 is something that can be cultivated through self-reflection, through hard experience, through a great mentor, through a significant life event. Darwin Smith fully blossomed after his cancer diagnosis. Joseph Coleman was profoundly shaped by World War II, particularly the last-minute change of orders that took him off a doomed ship on which he surely would have died. What this means is that the seeds of level 5 leadership are likely already within you. The question is whether you'll choose to grow them. But level 5 leadership is only the first piece of the puzzle, because even the best leader cannot transform a company alone. He needs the right people. And what Collins found about how the great companies built their teams will make you question everything you've ever believed about hiring, strategy, and vision. If you had to start a company tomorrow, what would you do first? Most of us would answer that question the same way. You'd figure out the vision, the mission, the strategy, what you're going to build, who you're going to sell it to, how you're going to win. That's what every business school teaches. That's what every management book preaches. First, you set the direction. Then you find the people to execute it. When Jim Collins and his team started their research, that's exactly what they expected to find. They found something completely the opposite. Chapter 2. First who, then what? In the early 1970s, the banking industry in America was sleepy, comfortable, protected, a genteel club where bankers wore nice suits, ate in marble dining rooms, and didn't have to compete very hard for anything. But a man named Dick Cooley, the CEO of Wells Fargo, sensed that something was coming. He didn't know what exactly, he didn't know when, but he knew that the banking industry was about to undergo wrenching change. Now here's where most CEOs would have done what every business book recommends. Develop a strategy for the coming change, map out the future, anticipate the moves, position the company. Dick Cooley did none of that. Instead, he did something that sounds almost ridiculously simple. He started hiring exceptional people, not for specific roles, not for a defined strategy, just exceptional people, whenever and wherever he found them. If I'm not smart enough to see the changes that are coming, he said, they will, and they'll be flexible enough to deal with them. When banking deregulation finally hit in the 1980s, it was the biggest disruption that industry had ever seen. And when those changes came, no bank handled them better than Wells Fargo. At a time when the rest of the banking sector fell 59% behind the general stock market, Wells Fargo beat the market by over 3 times. Why? Because by the time the storm arrived, Wells Fargo had already gathered the best banking team in America under one roof. When the team listed the Wells Fargo executives from those years to the researchers, they were stunned. Nearly every single person had gone on to become CEO of a major company. Bill Aldinger at Household Finance, Jack Grundhofer at US Bancorp, Frank Newman at Bankers Trust, Richard Rosenberg at Bank of America, Bob Joss at one of the largest banks in Australia, then later Dean of the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Not exactly your garden variety executive team. Now compare that to what was happening across the street. Bank of America, in those same years, followed a model that someone literally named weak generals, strong lieutenants. The idea was simple. If you pick strong generals for key positions, their competitors will leave. But if you pick weak generals, placeholders really, then the strong lieutenants below them will stick around. The result was a company full of, in one retired executive's words, plastic people who had been trained to quietly submit to the dictates of a domineering CEO. Sam Armacost, who inherited this culture, described his first management meetings this way, quote, "I came away quite distressed. Not only couldn't I get conflict, I couldn't even get comment. They were all waiting to see which way the wind blew." What happened next is the part you don't want to miss. After Bank of America lost over $1 billion in the mid-1980s, they decided they needed to bring in strong generals to turn the bank around. And where do you think they found those strong generals? Right across the street, at Wells Fargo. In fact, Bank of America recruited so many Wells Fargo executives that people inside started referring to themselves as Wells of America. This is the lesson Collins drew from it. The great companies didn't start by figuring out where to drive the bus. They started by getting the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats. Only then did they figure out where to drive. First who, then what. Now why does that order matter so much? Collins identified 3 reasons. First, if you start with who instead of what, you can adapt to a changing world. If people join your team because of where you're going, what happens when you get 10 miles down the road and you need to change direction? You've got a problem. But if people join because of who else is on the bus, then changing direction is easy. Hey, I got on this bus because of who else is on it. If we need to change direction to be more successful, fine with me. Second, if you have the right people, the problem of how to motivate and manage them largely goes away. The right people don't need to be tightly managed. They don't need to be fired up. They are self-motivated by an inner drive to produce the best results and to be part of something great. And third, this is the one that hurts. If you have the wrong people, it doesn't matter whether you found the right direction. You still won't have a great company. Great vision without great people is irrelevant. Now you might be thinking, okay, that just sounds like good management. Hire well. What's new about that? Here's what's new. It's the sheer rigor of it. The degree of discipline these companies applied to people decisions before anything else. Think about David Maxwell at Fannie Mae again, the one who gave back the $5.5 million. When Maxwell became CEO during the company's darkest days, losing $1 million every single business day, the board desperately wanted to know how he was going to rescue the company. They wanted a plan, a strategy, anything. Maxwell didn't give them one. Not yet. His first act was to sit down and interview every single officer in the company. He said to each one, "Look, this is going to be a very hard challenge. I want you to think about how demanding this is going to be. If you don't think you're going to like it, that's fine. Nobody's going to hate you." Maxwell made it absolutely clear that there would only be seats on the bus for A players willing to put forth an A+ effort. If you weren't up for it, you needed to get off the bus, and get off now. One executive who had just uprooted his entire life and career to join Fannie Mae walked into Maxwell's office and said, "I listened to you very carefully, and I don't want to do this." He left. He went back to where he came from, In all, 14 of 26 executives left the company. They were replaced by some of the best, smartest, hardest working executives in the entire world of finance. Maxwell was running a company hemorrhaging $1 million a day, and his first move was not to fix the bleeding, it was to fix the team. That is first who as a rigorous discipline, not a slogan. Now here's an idea that might break your brain a little. Collins's team studied executive compensation in obsessive detail. They expected to find that the great companies used radically different compensation systems, bigger bonuses, more stock options, smarter incentives. They found nothing, no pattern at all. The only meaningful difference was that the great company executives, 10 years after the transition, were earning slightly less total cash compensation than their counterparts at the still mediocre comparison companies. Why doesn't compensation matter? Because if you have the right people on the bus, they're going to do everything within their power to build a great company, not because of what they'll get for it, but because they simply cannot imagine settling for anything less. The right people will do the right things regardless of the incentive system. The wrong people will do the wrong things no matter how clever your incentive system is. So if compensation isn't the differentiator, what makes someone the right person? Here Collins found something unexpected. The great companies cared less about specific knowledge, skills, or background, and far more about character. Things like work ethic, basic intelligence, dedication to commitments, values. Dave Nassif, an executive at Pitney Bowes, put it this way: I used to be in the Marines, and the Marines get a lot of credit for building people's values. But that's not the way it really works. The Marine Corps recruits people who already share the Corps' values. Then it provides them with the training required to accomplish the mission. We look at it the same way. We don't just look at experience. We want to know, who are they? Why are they? One good to great executive told the researchers that his best hiring decision came from a man who had no business experience whatsoever. The man had been captured twice during World War II, and he'd escaped both times. I thought, the executive said, that anyone who could do that shouldn't have trouble with business. Now if you have the right people, the great companies were rigorous, not ruthless. And the distinction matters. What's the difference? To be ruthless means hacking and cutting people, especially in difficult times, or wantonly firing without thoughtful consideration. To be rigorous means consistently applying exacting standards at all times, at all levels, especially in upper management. Rigor protects the best people. Ruthlessness destroys morale. In 1986, Wells Fargo acquired Crocker Bank. Now, every bank merger in that era was about cutting costs. But what Wells Fargo did was unusual. They concluded right up front that the vast majority of Crocker's managers were the wrong people for what Wells Fargo was building. Crocker had a posh banker culture, a marbled executive dining room with its own chef and $500,000 worth of china. Quite a contrast to Wells Fargo, where management ate food prepared by a college dormitory food service. So Wells Fargo terminated most of the Crocker management team. 1,600 managers gone on day one. But, and this is the key, Wells Fargo also let go some of its own managers, in cases where the Crocker managers were judged better qualified. It wasn't about protecting Wells Fargo people. It was about keeping the best people, regardless of which side they came from. Like a professional sports team, only the best make the cut. One Wells Fargo executive summed it up, quote, "The only way to deliver to the people who are achieving is to not burden them with the people who are not achieving, to let people languish in uncertainty for months or years, stealing precious time they could be using to move on to something else, when in the end, they're not going to make it anyway. That is ruthless. To deal with it directly, up front, so people can get on with their lives. That is rigorous." Out of the 3 practical disciplines Collins extracted from his research, the second one is the one that haunts me the most. When you know you need to make a people change, act. We've all been here. We have the wrong person on the bus. We know it, but we wait. We delay. We try alternatives. We give a third chance. We give a fourth chance. We hope the situation will improve. We invest time trying to manage the person. We build little workaround systems to compensate for their shortcomings. We tell ourselves we're being patient. We tell ourselves we're being kind. Meanwhile, our best people watch. They wonder why we're letting this go on. They start carrying extra weight to make up for the person who isn't pulling theirs. They get frustrated. They start looking for the door. Letting the wrong people hang around is not kindness to them. It's stealing portions of their life, time they could be spending finding a place where they would actually flourish. Collins offers 2 simple questions to know when to act. First, if it were a hiring decision rather than a firing decision, would you hire this person again? Second, if the person came to tell you they were leaving for an exciting new opportunity, would you feel terribly disappointed or secretly relieved? If the answer to the first is no, or the answer to the second is relieved, you already know. Here's the third discipline, and it's one of the most counterintuitive ideas in the entire book. Put your best people on your biggest opportunities, not your biggest problems. In the early 1960s, R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris derived almost all of their revenues from the domestic American market. R.J. Reynolds' approach to the rest of the world was, in their own words, "If somebody out there wants a camel, let them call us." Joe Coleman at Philip Morris took a different view. He saw international markets as the single best opportunity for long-term growth, despite the fact that international was, at that moment, less than 1% of the company's revenues. So Coleman pulled his #1 executive, George Weissman, off the primary domestic business, where 99% of the action was, and put him in charge of the tiny international operation, a struggling investment in Venezuela, another in Australia, a small operation in Canada. That was it. When the announcement was made, Weissman's colleagues thought he must have done something terribly wrong. "I didn't know," Weissman later said, "whether I was being thrown sideways, downstairs, or out the window." 20 years later, Forbes called it a stroke of genius. Under Weissman's leadership, International became the largest and fastest growing part of Philip Morris. Marlboro became the best-selling cigarette in the world. In fact, it became #1 globally 3 years before it became #1 in the United States. When you take your best people and put them on your biggest opportunity, you don't just solve a problem, you build something extraordinary. Managing your problems can only make you good. Building your opportunities is the only way to become great. So that's the first piece of the puzzle. Level 5 leaders, building a team of disciplined people. But disciplined people alone don't create great companies. The right people, in the right seats, still need to make the right decisions. And the next finding in this study is about what those decisions actually look like, starting with the most uncomfortable discipline of them all. Chapter 3. Confront the brutal facts, yet never lose faith. In the early 1950s, the largest retailer in the world was a grocery chain called the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. We knew it as A&P. At one point, A&P was the largest retailing organization on Earth, ranking behind only General Motors in total annual sales among American corporations. Meanwhile, Kroger, its eventual rival, was less than half the size, an unspectacular grocery chain barely keeping pace with the general market. Then something happened. Slowly, then suddenly, A&P began to falter, and Kroger began to climb. From 1959 to 1973, both companies still lagged the market, but starting in the mid-1970s, the two diverged completely. Over the next 25 years, Kroger generated cumulative returns 10 times better than the market and 80 times better than A&P. How could the largest retailer in the world become so awful? And how could the unremarkable competitor become so spectacular? Both companies were facing the exact same reality. Americans were changing. The post-war frugality was gone. The new American consumer wanted nicer stores, bigger stores, more choices, fresh-baked bread, 45 kinds of cereal, 10 types of milk. They wanted to do their banking and get their flu shots while shopping. They wanted superstores. Both Kroger and A&P had experimented with the new superstore concept in the 1970s. Both companies could see the data. Both companies had nearly identical resources to make the change, but A&P couldn't bring itself to abandon what had made it great. The old format, the traditional stores, the cheap and convenient identity that had built the company. Whenever new leadership at A&P took a hard look at the data, they would launch a flashy new program, a new pricing scheme, a new advertising push, a new identity campaign. None of it worked because none of it confronted the truth. The old model was dead. Kroger did something completely different. Kroger looked at the same data and accepted what it meant. Lyle Everingham, the CEO during the pivotal years, told the researchers, quote, "I find your question a bit perplexing. We did extensive research, and the data came back loud and clear. Super combination stores were the way of the future. Sure, there was some skepticism at first, but once we looked at the facts, there was really no question about what we had to do. So we just did it." What did they do? They decided to eliminate, change, or replace every single store in the company and exit every region that did not fit the new reality. Stop for a second and let that sink in. Kroger looked at itself and concluded that virtually nothing about how it currently did business was going to work in the future. So they decided to rebuild the entire system, store by store, block by block, city by city, state by state. By the early 1990s, Kroger had rebuilt itself completely, and in 1999, it became the #1 grocery chain in America. Meanwhile, A&P still had over half its stores in the old 1950s format, a sad remnant of what had once been one of the great American institutions. What's the difference between the two companies? It isn't intelligence, it isn't resources, it isn't industry insight. It is the willingness to look at the brutal facts directly, to turn over the rock, and to see what's underneath, no matter how ugly it is. One Pitney Bowes executive told the researchers, quote, "When you turn over rocks and look at all the squiggly things underneath, you can either put the rock down or you can say, my job is to turn over rocks and look at the squiggly things, even if what you see can scare the hell out of you." Pitney Bowes became famous for this culture. At their first management meeting every year, they would spend about 15 minutes talking about the previous year's performance, almost always superb, and then 2 hours talking about the scary squiggly things that might impede future performance. Their sales meetings were not rah-rah motivational sessions. They were forums where the entire management team would sit down and let salespeople, the people in direct contact with customers, challenge them, question them, and tell them what the company was doing wrong. Now contrast that with Bank of America in the previous chapter, where managers wouldn't even make a comment until they knew how the CEO felt. The moment a leader becomes the primary reality that people in the organization worry about, rather than the actual reality outside, you have a recipe for mediocrity. Or worse. But there's something deeper here, something that goes beyond practice, and it's the most powerful idea in this entire chapter. In the mid-1990s, Jim Collins had the opportunity to spend an afternoon with a man named Admiral Jim Stockdale. Stockdale had been the highest-ranking United States military officer held in the Hanoi Hilton, the notorious prisoner of war camp during the Vietnam War. He was tortured over 20 times during his 8 years of imprisonment, from 1965 to 1973. He had no prisoner rights, no set release date, no certainty that he would ever see his family again. To prevent his captors from using him in propaganda films, he beat himself with a stool and cut himself with a razor, deliberately disfiguring his own face. He exchanged secret intelligence with his wife through coded letters, knowing that discovery would mean more torture. He created systems to help other prisoners survive torture. He invented a tap code, a 5x5 matrix of taps that allowed isolated prisoners to communicate through walls. On the 3rd anniversary of his being shot down, the other prisoners, under imposed silence, swept and mopped the central yard in code, swish-swashing out the words, "We love you," to Stockdale. When he finally returned home, Admiral Stockdale became the first 3-star officer in the history of the Navy to wear both aviator wings and the Congressional Medal of Honor. Collins, before their lunch, read the book that Stockdale and his wife had written together, and as he read it, he found himself getting depressed. It was just so bleak. The uncertainty, the brutality, the years of darkness. Then it dawned on him, here I am, sitting in my warm, comfortable office, looking out over the beautiful Stanford campus on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. I'm getting depressed reading this, and I know how the story ends. I know he gets out. If it feels depressing for me, how on earth did he deal with it when he was actually there and did not know the end of the story? So when they met, Collins asked him, "How did you handle it?" Stockdale answered without hesitation, "I never lost faith in the end of the story. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which, in retrospect, I would not trade." They walked in silence for a while. Stockdale was limping. His leg had never fully recovered from years of torture. After about 100 meters, Collins asked another question. Who didn't make it out? Stockdale's answer was immediate. "Oh, that's easy. The optimists." Collins was confused. "The optimists? I don't understand." "The optimists," Stockdale said. "Oh, they were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come, and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come, and Easter would go. Then Thanksgiving. Then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart." Another long pause. More walking. Then Stockdale turned to Collins and said something that has echoed through every leadership conversation in the 25 years since. "This is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." Collins called it the Stockdale paradox, and when he brought it back to his research team, one of his analysts immediately recognized it. "That's exactly what I've been struggling with," he said. Kroger was like Stockdale. A&P was like the optimists who always thought they'd be out by Christmas. And then the rest of the team chimed in. They saw it everywhere. Wells Fargo facing deregulation, Kimberly-Clark facing Procter & Gamble, Pitney Bowes losing its monopoly, Nucor facing cheap imports. In every great company, the same paradoxical pattern, unwavering faith that they would prevail, and ruthless honesty about how bad the current situation actually was, held in the same mind. At the same time, this is what people get wrong about positive thinking. The optimists in Stockdale's prison camp weren't positive thinkers. They were delusional thinkers. They confused the strength of their wishes with the strength of reality, and reality eventually broke their hearts. The Stockdale paradox is not about choosing between faith and facts. It's about holding both at once. The faith says, we will find a way through this. The facts say, here is exactly how bad it is. When you can hold both, really hold both, something remarkable happens. The right path forward becomes self-evident, and once it does, you're ready to discover what the great companies all eventually discovered. The simple, unifying idea that would guide every decision they made for the next 20 years. And it turns out that idea, when they finally found it, was so simple and so obvious that it looked almost laughable from the outside. But on the inside, it changed everything. Chapter 4. The Hedgehog Concept. Are you a hedgehog or a fox? In 1953, a British philosopher named Isaiah Berlin wrote a famous essay built around an ancient Greek line. The fox knows many things, The hedgehog knows one big thing. Picture it this way. The fox is cunning, fast, sleek, crafty, beautiful. He spends his days circling the hedgehog's den, plotting attacks, building strategies, watching for the perfect moment. The fox is what you'd bet on every single time. The hedgehog, on the other hand, well, the hedgehog is dowdy, a little awkward looking, a kind of genetic mix-up between a porcupine and a small armadillo. He waddles along, going about his simple day, searching for lunch and taking care of his home. One day, the fox lies in cunning silence at the junction of the trail. The hedgehog, minding his own business, wanders right into his path. Aha, thinks the fox, I've got you now. And he leaps, bounding across the ground, lightning fast. The hedgehog, sensing danger, looks up and thinks, here we go again, will he ever learn? And he rolls up into a perfect little ball, a sphere of sharp spikes, pointing outward in every direction. The fox sees the spikes, calls off the attack, and retreats back into the forest to think up a new strategy. Day after day, this little battle plays out, and despite the greater cunning of the fox, the hedgehog always wins. Berlin extrapolated from that little parable to divide all of humanity into two basic groups. Foxes, who pursue many ends at the same time, see the world in all its complexity, and never integrate their thinking into one overall concept. And hedgehogs, who simplify the world into a single, organizing idea, a basic principle, a fundamental concept that unifies and guides everything they do. What Collins and his team found after several years of looking at the data was something striking. Every single one of the 11 great companies was a hedgehog, and every single one of the comparison companies, the ones that failed to become great, was a fox. The great companies knew one big thing, and they stuck to it. So what was Walgreens' one big thing? Walgreens had been around for decades. A drugstore chain, like 100 other drugstore chains. Mediocre performance, forgettable. Until one day, after years of internal debate, the leadership grasped a simple, blindingly obvious idea. Walgreens could be the best in the world at one specific thing, not just being a drugstore. Convenient drugstores. The most convenient drugstores possible. Then they connected this idea to a simple economic insight. Profit per customer visit. Not profit per store. Not profit per square foot. Profit per customer visit. Now, once they understood this, everything changed. They began clustering stores so tightly together that some streets had 9 Walgreens per mile. Why? Because tight clustering created local economies of scale, which generated cash, which paid for more stores, which drew more customers, which generated more cash. They added high-margin services like 1-hour photo developing, which increased profit per visit. More convenience meant more customer visits. More visits times more profit per visit poured cash back into the system. So they built more convenient stores, store by store, block by block, city by city, region by region. Walgreens became more and more of a hedgehog, with one simple idea, executed with relentless focus. Now compare that to Eckerd. Eckerd was a competitor in roughly the same position at roughly the same moment in history, same industry, same opportunities, identical revenues in fact. In the year that Walgreens began locking onto its hedgehog idea, Walgreens and Eckerd both had revenues of $1.7 billion, but Eckerd's executives were deal makers. They jumped at opportunities. They acquired clumps of stores, 42 units here, 36 units there, with no unifying theme. And in the early 1980s, just as Walgreens became religious about its convenient drugstore concept, Eckerd threw itself into the home video market. The CEO told Forbes, quote, "Some feel the purer we are, the better we'll be, but I want growth." Eckerd's home video adventure lost $31 million before they finally dumped it onto Tandy, which crowed about getting the deal for $72 million below book value. 10 years after the moment when Walgreens and Eckerd had identical revenues, Walgreens had grown to more than twice the size of Eckerd. 20 years later, Walgreens was one of the most successful companies in America. Eckerd had ceased to exist as an independent company. Same starting point, same industry, same resources, two totally different fates. So what is a hedgehog concept really? A hedgehog concept is a simple, crystalline idea that sits at the intersection of three circles. The first circle is what you can be the best in the world at, and equally important, what you cannot be the best in the world at. The second circle is what drives your economic engine, the single metric that if you optimized for it, would have the greatest impact on your sustained results. The third circle is what you are deeply passionate about, not what you can manufacture passion for, what you genuinely cannot help but care about. Get all three circles. Translate the intersection into a simple, crystalline idea. That's your hedgehog concept. Now here's the part that surprises everyone. The best in the world question is much more severe than what most people think. Consider the contrast between two pharmaceutical companies, Abbott Laboratories and Upjohn. In 1964, these two companies were almost identical. Similar revenues, similar profits, similar product lines, both family managed, both lagging behind the rest of the pharmaceutical industry, both with their entire history rooted in pharmaceuticals. By 1964, George Kane and his Abbott team faced a hard truth. While Abbott had drowsed along living off its cash cow drug, erythromycin, companies like Merck had built research engines that rivaled Harvard and Berkeley. Abbott had lost the chance to ever be the best pharmaceutical company. The gap was too big. Now what would most companies do here? They'd keep trying, they'd double R&D spending, they'd promise the board it was about to turn around. They'd insist that, with the right investment, they could catch Merck. Abbott did the opposite. They confronted the brutal facts. They were not going to beat Merck, ever. So they asked a different question. We've lost the chance to be the best pharmaceutical company. What can we be the best at? After several years of searching, they found it. They could become the best company in the world at creating products that make healthcare more cost-effective. Hospital nutritional products, diagnostic devices, things that helped reduce healthcare costs from the inside. Once they understood this, they restructured everything around it. They became the #1 company in hospital nutritionals, the #1 company in diagnostic devices. They beat the market 4 times over the next 15 years. They outperformed Merck and Pfizer. What did Upjohn do? Upjohn refused to confront the same reality. They kept telling themselves they could beat Merck. They poured nearly twice as much of their revenue into R&D as Abbott did, and they fell further and further behind. Eventually, in desperation, they diversified into plastics and chemicals, businesses they had no business being in. By 1995, they'd been acquired. Same starting point. 2 companies. One confronted what it could and could not be the best at. The other clung to the comforting lie that it could be everything. Here's why this is so important. There's a difference between having a core business and having a hedgehog concept. Just because something is your core business, just because you've been doing it for years, or even decades, does not mean you can be the best in the world at it. And if you cannot be the best in the world at your core business, then your core business cannot be the foundation of your great company. This idea breaks people. They cannot accept it. Collins uses a personal analogy. Picture a young person who gets straight A's in high school calculus, scores high on the math SAT, demonstrates real competence at mathematics. Does that mean they should become a mathematician? Not necessarily. Suppose they go to college and continue earning A's in math, but they meet other students whose brains are simply wired differently. As one student in this exact situation put it, "It would take me 3 hours to finish a final exam." There were other students who finished the same final in 30 minutes and earned an A+. I could be a very competent mathematician, but I realized I could never be one of the best. Many of us have fallen into careers where we can never attain complete mastery or fulfillment, not because we lack ability, but because we mistook competence for calling. The hedgehog concept is not what you want to be the best at. It's what you can be the best at. The distinction is absolutely crucial. Now the second circle, your economic engine, is about finding the one metric that drives everything else. Collins calls this the profit per X question. At Walgreens, it was profit per customer visit. At Wells Fargo, after Reichert simplified the bank, it was profit per employee. At Nucor, the steel company, it was profit per ton of finished steel, which captured both their work ethic culture and their advanced manufacturing technology. Most companies never identify a single profit per X metric. They have 10 different metrics, 20. None of them tell them what's actually going on. The discipline of forcing yourself to find one denominator, the single one that, if you optimized for it, would change everything, forces you into a deeper understanding of your own business. And then the third circle, passion. Now this might seem soft, fuzzy, even out of place in a discussion of corporate strategy, but Collins found something remarkable. You cannot manufacture passion. You cannot motivate it into people. Passion is something you discover, something already there, something that already exists in some people around some kinds of work. When Collins interviewed the executives at Philip Morris, he was stunned by their passion. These were people selling cigarettes, beer, caffeine, Velveeta, and they were deeply, fanatically passionate about it. The vice chairman in 1979, a man named Ross Milheiser, said, "I love cigarettes. It's one of the things that makes life really worth living." Now compare that to R.J. Reynolds, also a tobacco company. Same industry, same societal pressure, same potential. But to the R.J. Reynolds executives, tobacco was just a way to make money. They started diversifying into anything they could get growth from. They had no passion, and eventually, they cared only about making themselves rich through a leveraged buyout. Philip Morris loved what they did. R.J. Reynolds was just doing business. And over the years, the difference in performance was massive. The lesson here is not that you should pretend to love what you do. The lesson is that great companies only do things they can get genuinely passionate about. As Collins puts it, the Kimberly-Clark executives made the shift to paper-based consumer products, in part because they could get more passionate about them. One of them said of traditional paper, quote, "They just don't have the charisma of a diaper." Imagine being passionate about diapers, or about deodorant, or about postage meters. Sounds absurd, but the people at these companies were. Not because they manufactured the passion, because they had built their company around the things they actually cared about. Now there's a story about a hedgehog concept that I think captures it better than any company example could. And it comes from Collins's own family. His wife Joanne was a runner and a triathlete in the early 1980s. She'd been training hard, building experience, race times, swim splits, accumulating data. One day, she entered a race against many of the best women triathletes in the world. She came out of the water hundreds of places behind the top swimmers. She had a heavy, non-aerodynamic bike. She had to push it up a long hill. And somehow, by the end of the race, she crossed the finish line in the top 10. A few weeks later, sitting at breakfast, Joanne looked up from her morning newspaper, and calmly, quietly, she said, "I think I could win the Ironman." The Ironman, the world championship of triathlons, 2.4 miles of ocean swimming, 112 miles of cycling, capped off by a full 26.2-mile marathon run on the hot, lava-baked Kona coast of Hawaii. Of course, she continued, I'd have to quit my job, turn down my offers to graduate school. She'd been admitted to several of the top business schools in the country. I'd have to commit to full-time training. But here's the thing. There was no bravado in her words, no hype, no pleading, no trying to convince him. She was simply observing what she had come to understand was a fact, a truth no more shocking than stating that the walls were painted white. She had the passion, she had the genetics, and if she won races, she'd have the economics. The goal to win the Ironman flowed naturally from a clear understanding of her own hedgehog concept, so she went for it. She quit her job, she turned down graduate school, she sold the mills, and 3 years later, on a hot October day in 1985, she crossed the finish line at the Hawaii Ironman in first place, world champion. When Joanne set out to win the Ironman, she did not know if she would become the world's best triathlete, but she understood that she could, that it was in the realm of possibility, that she was not living in a delusion, and that distinction makes all the difference. One last thing about the hedgehog concept. It takes time. The average great company in this study took 4 years to find its hedgehog concept. 4 years of debate, of iteration, of testing ideas and watching them break. So if you don't have your hedgehog concept yet, don't panic. The great companies didn't either. Not at first. They had the discipline to keep searching until they found it. That's the part most people miss, because once they had it, once that single clarifying idea snapped into focus, everything else became possible. But knowing your hedgehog concept is not enough. You have to live by it, religiously, fanatically, every single day, even when, especially when, opportunities arise that would pull you away from it. And that requires something rare, something most organizations talk about endlessly, but very few actually possess. Chapter 5. A culture of discipline. Let me tell you about a man named Dave Scott. Dave Scott was a 6-time winner of the Hawaii Ironman triathlon. In training, he would ride his bike 75 miles, swim 20,000 meters, and run 17 miles, on average, every single day. Dave Scott did not have a weight problem. The man was burning at least 5,000 calories a day in training. Yet Dave Scott believed that a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet would give him just a tiny additional edge over his competitors. So Dave Scott, a world-class athlete consuming massive amounts of food just to function, would do something that sounds insane. He would literally rinse his cottage cheese to get the last bit of extra fat off. Now there's no scientific evidence that rinsing cottage cheese actually helped him win the Ironman. That's not the point of the story. The point is that rinsing his cottage cheese was just one more small thing, one more tiny step added to all the other tiny steps to create a consistent, almost fanatical program of self-discipline. Collins pictures Dave Scott in the middle of the Ironman marathon, 26 miles of running in 100-degree heat on black baked lava fields after already swimming 2.5 miles and cycling 112, pushing through pain that would break almost anyone. And maybe in that moment thinking to himself, compared to rinsing my cottage cheese every day, this just isn't that bad. It's a bizarre analogy, but it's exactly the kind of standard the great companies were built on. Collins's team kept finding the same words coming up in the descriptions of the great companies: disciplined, rigorous, dogged, determined, diligent, precise, fastidious, systematic, words that were strikingly absent from the materials on the comparison companies. The great companies were full of people who rinsed their cottage cheese, people who did the small things, every day, without being asked. So what does a culture of discipline actually look like? Collins describes it as freedom and responsibility within a framework. Picture an airline pilot. She sits in the cockpit, surrounded by dozens of complicated switches and gauges. She doesn't have freedom to do anything she wants. She works inside a strict system. She follows a pre-flight checklist. She communicates with air traffic control. She does what the system tells her to do. But within that system, the most important decisions rest entirely with her. Whether to take off, whether to land, whether to abort an approach in bad weather. The pilot has ultimate responsibility for the aircraft and the lives of every person on it. The great companies were like that. A consistent system with clear constraints, But within that system, people had real freedom and real responsibility. The company hired self-disciplined people who didn't need to be managed, and then they managed the system, not the people. But here's the trap that catches a lot of companies. They confuse a culture of discipline with a tyrannical disciplinarian. Consider Lee Iacocca at Chrysler again. When Iacocca took over Chrysler in 1979, the company was in anarchy. He imposed discipline through sheer force of personality. He restructured management. He instituted strict financial controls. He laid off massive numbers of people to preserve cash, and he produced spectacular short-term results. But here's what happened next. Iacocca became famous. He got distracted. He bought Italian villas. He bottled his own wine. And critically, he never built a culture of discipline that could function without him. When the second half of his tenure rolled around, the discipline began to crumble. Iacocca started making undisciplined diversifications. He bought an entire aerospace company. Chrysler slid 31% behind the market, and eventually, the company faced bankruptcy again. What's the common thread? You had a strong-willed leader imposing discipline from the top. The leader was the discipline. There was no internal culture that could sustain itself without him. Discipline that depends on the disciplinarian is not discipline. It's compliance, and compliance dies the moment the disciplinarian walks out the door. A real culture of discipline is something else entirely. Consider what Carl Reichert did when he took over Wells Fargo. Reichert set out to rip 100 years of banker mentality out of the system. He said, "There's too much waste in banking. Getting rid of it takes tenacity, not brilliance." So Reichert set the tone at the top. We are not going to ask everyone else to suffer while we sit in luxury. We will start by rinsing our own cottage cheese right here in the executive suite. He froze executive salaries for 2 years, despite the fact that Wells Fargo was enjoying some of the most profitable years in its history. He shut the executive dining room and replaced it with a college dorm food service caterer. He closed the executive elevator. He sold the corporate jets. He banned green plants from the executive suite because they were too expensive to water. He removed the free coffee. He even eliminated the Christmas trees from management. When people came to him with reports submitted in fancy binders, he threw them back, asking, "Would you spend your own money this way? What does a binder add to anything?" Reichert would sit through meetings in a beat-up old chair with the stuffing hanging out of it. He'd just pick at the stuffing while listening to proposals to spend money. And according to one article, just sitting in that chair, a lot of must-do projects just melted away. Across the street at Bank of America, the executives faced exactly the same competitive pressures. They knew they needed to eliminate waste, but they could not rinse their own cottage cheese. They preserved their luxurious executive kingdom, a corner suite with oriental rugs, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an elevator that swept past lesser floors in a single quiet whoosh. One bank rinsed its cottage cheese. The other bank could not bring itself to even consider it. The performance gap that followed was massive. Now there's one more practice that defined the culture of discipline at these companies. And of all the ideas in this book, this might be the one that's most useful to your own life. They didn't just have a to-do list. They had a stop-doing list. When Darwin Smith took over Kimberly-Clark, he made remarkable use of stop-doing lists. He saw that playing the annual earnings forecast game with Wall Street focused everyone too much on the short term, so he just stopped doing it. On balance, he said, "I see no net advantage to our stockholders when we annually forecast future earnings. We will not do it." He saw title creep as a sign of class consciousness and bureaucratic empire building, so he unplugged titles. Nobody at Kimberly-Clark had a title, unless their job required external interaction with the outside world. He saw expanding layers of management as the natural result of empire building, so he established a simple rule. If you couldn't justify to your peers the need for at least 15 people reporting to you to fulfill your responsibilities, you got 0 people reporting to you. Now think about this in your own life. You have a to-do list. We all do. It grows, it expands. We add to it endlessly. We try to build momentum by doing more and doing more and doing more. But do you have a stop doing list? What if the secret to greatness was not adding more, but subtracting? Collins puts it this way: in a great transformation, budgeting is not about figuring out how much each activity gets. It's about determining which activities best support your hedgehog concept and should be fully strengthened, and which should be eliminated entirely. Kimberly-Clark didn't just reallocate resources away from paper. They sold the entire paper business. They eliminated it completely. One time, Collins met with some executives from a paper company that had competed directly with Kimberly-Clark in the years before the transformation. He asked them what they thought of what Kimberly-Clark had done. "What Kimberly did is not fair," they said. "Not fair?" Collins looked confused. "Oh, sure. They'd become a much more successful company. But you know, if we'd sold our paper business and become a powerful consumer company, we could have been great too. But we just had too much invested in it, and we couldn't have brought ourselves to do it. We couldn't have brought ourselves to do it." That sentence captures so much. The discipline to do the right thing is not a question of intelligence. It's a question of will. The great companies had the discipline to channel almost all their resources into one or a few arenas. They rarely hedged their bets. Once they understood their 3 circles, they bet on those circles. The most effective investment strategy, Collins observes, is a highly undiversified portfolio. When you are right, the real question is, once you know the right thing, do you have the discipline to do the right thing? And equally important, do you have the discipline to stop doing the wrong things? But the great companies had one more advantage, something that, when they got it right, would accelerate everything they were doing, and when they got it wrong, would only accelerate their decline. And in the next idea, Collins discovered something that shocked his entire research team, and it has everything to do with the most overhyped force in modern business. Chapter 6. Technology Accelerators. In the late 1990s, something strange happened to American business. Companies that had never made a single dollar in profit were suddenly being valued at billions. 25-year-old founders with nothing more than a website and a business plan were going public, flipping shares, and walking away rich. The phrase "built to flip" replaced "built to last." All you had to do was attach the word internet to whatever you were doing, and the money poured in. At the absolute peak of this frenzy, a startup called drugstore.com issued its public challenge to Walgreens. And at first, it looked like Walgreens was going to lose badly. Walgreens lost over 40% of its stock price in the months leading up to the drugstore.com offering. $15 billion in market value evaporated. Analysts downgraded the stock. Forbes magazine declared, quote, "Investors seem to think the web race will be won by competitors who hit the ground running. Companies like drugstore.com, which trades at 398 times revenue rather than Walgreens." So how did Walgreens respond? How did this old, stodgy brick-and-mortar drugstore react to being labeled a dinosaur in front of the entire investment world? Their CEO, Dan Jaunt, told Forbes, quote, "We're a crawl, walk, run company." While the internet world was screaming, Walgreens decided to do something almost unheard of in that moment of history. They decided to pause. They decided to think. Slow at first, crawl. They began experimenting with a small website. While they did so, they engaged in intense internal dialogue about the implications. How does the internet connect to our convenience concept? How can we tie it to our economic denominator of cash flow per customer visit? Throughout, the Walgreens executives embraced the Stockdale paradox. We have complete faith that we can prevail in an internet world as a great company, and we must also confront the brutal facts of reality about the internet. An internet leader made a snide comment about Walgreens around that time. Something like, "Oh, Walgreens, they're too old and stodgy for the internet world. They'll be left behind." The Walgreens people were annoyed, but they never publicly responded. One executive said, "Let's quietly go about doing what we need to do. It'll become clear soon enough that they just pulled the tail of the wrong dog." Then, a little faster, Walgreens began tying the internet directly to its sophisticated inventory and distribution model. Fill your prescription online, pop into your car, drive to any Walgreens in any city in the country, pick it up at the drive-thru, or have it shipped to you, whatever was most convenient. Then, finally, run. Walgreens launched an internet site as sophisticated as any pure.com, precisely 1 year after the Forbes article had called them dinosaurs. Walgreens stock had nearly doubled, and drugstore.com continuing to accumulate massive losses, announcing layoffs to conserve cash. At its peak, just a little over a year earlier, drugstore.com had traded at a price 26 times higher. It had lost nearly all its value. Walgreens went from crawl to walk to run. Drugstore.com went from run to walk to crawl. So what's the lesson here? It's not really about the internet bubble. Bubbles come and bubbles go. It happened with the railroads, with electricity, with radio, with the personal computer, with the internet, and it will happen again with technologies we can't yet imagine. The real question is, how do good to great companies think differently about technology? Collins found that in every single one of the 11 great companies, technology was important, but it was never the cause of the transformation. Every one of these companies became a pioneer in the application of carefully selected technologies. But notice the words: pioneer, application, carefully selected. Here's the central insight. When used right, technology becomes an accelerator of momentum, not a creator of it. The great companies never started their transitions with pioneering technology for a very simple reason. You cannot make good use of technology until you know which technologies are relevant. And which technologies are relevant? Only those that link directly to the 3 circles of your hedgehog concept. You might think Nuka's story would contradict this. Nuka became one of the most aggressive pioneers in mini-mill steel manufacturing. 2 books and dozens of articles celebrated their bold investments in advanced manufacturing technology. They became a cornerstone case study at business schools about how new technology can unseat old industries. So when Collins asked Ken Iverson, the CEO of Nucor, during its transition, to name the top 5 factors in their shift from good to great, where do you think he put technology? First, no. Second, no. Third, nope. Fourth, not even. Fifth, sorry, not even fifth. The primary factors, said Iverson, were the consistency of the company and our ability to project its philosophies throughout the whole organization. Of the 7 Nucor executives and board members Collins interviewed, only 1 picked technology as the #1 factor. Most focused on other things, getting people with a farmer work ethic on the bus, the simple management structure, the relentless performance culture. As one Nucor executive summed up, 20% of our success is the new technology we embrace, but 80% of our success is in the culture of our company. You could have given the exact same technology at the exact same time to 100 other companies with the same resources. They would not have produced Nucor's results. Like the Daytona 500, the primary variable in winning is not the car, it's the driver and the team. Collins makes the point with Vietnam. The United States had the most technologically advanced fighting force the world had ever seen. Superjets, helicopter gunships, sophisticated communications, and it lost the war to an opponent armed with a simple, coherent strategy and a rifle called the AK-47. The most technologically advanced army in the world lost to one of the least technologically advanced because technology by itself was never enough. But here's the deeper truth Collins discovered. The companies that perpetuate mediocrity are not driven by ambition for greatness. They're driven by fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of looking foolish, fear of missing out on the next big thing. Those who turn good into great are motivated by a deep creative urge and an inner compulsion for excellence for its own sake. Those who build and perpetuate mediocrity are motivated by the fear of being left behind. No technology, no matter how amazing, no matter how revolutionary, can by itself make a company great. No technology can make you level 5. No technology can turn the wrong people into the right people. No technology can give you the discipline to confront the brutal facts. Technology is never the answer. Technology only ever accelerates the answer you already have. Or, if you have the wrong answer, it accelerates your decline. Which brings us to the last big idea in this book, the metaphor that ties all of this together. The image Collins came to use over and over again, the one that captures the entire feel of going from good to great better than any other. Chapter 7. The Flywheel and the Doom Loop. Picture a giant flywheel, a massive metal disc, about 30 feet across, 2 feet thick, weighing about 5,000 pounds, mounted horizontally on an axle. Your job is to get this flywheel rotating as fast and for as long as possible. You start pushing. The first push barely moves it. You push harder. The flywheel inches forward almost imperceptibly. You push again. Maybe after an hour of pushing, you complete 1 full turn. You keep pushing. 2 turns. 3. The flywheel builds a tiny bit of momentum. 5 turns. 10. 20. You start to feel something. The flywheel is moving with its own weight now, just a little. You keep pushing. The flywheel moves a little faster with each turn. 50 turns. 100. 200. You're sweating. Your arms ache. But the disc is moving. Then, at some point, and you cannot say exactly when, breakthrough. The momentum of the thing kicks in your favor. The flywheel hurls forward, turn after turn after turn. Whoosh, its own heavy weight working for you now. You're pushing no harder than you did during that first rotation, but the flywheel is going faster and faster. 1,000 turns, 10,000, 100,000. The huge heavy disc flies forward with almost unstoppable momentum. Now imagine someone walks up to you in this moment and asks, what was the one big push that caused this thing to go so fast? You couldn't answer that question. It's a nonsensical question. Was it the first push, the 5th, the 100th, the 10,000th? It was all of them, added together in an overall accumulation of effort applied in a consistent direction. Some pushes may have been bigger than others, but any single heave, no matter how large, was only a small fraction of the total cumulative effect. That, Collins says, is exactly what going from good to great feels like from the inside. No matter how dramatic the end result, the great company transformations never happened in one fell swoop. There was no single defining action, no grand program, no killer innovation, no solitary lucky break, no wrenching revolution. Good to great comes about by a cumulative process, step by step, action by action, decision by decision, turn by turn of the flywheel, adding up over time to sustained and spectacular results. But the media, the people watching from the outside, they never see it this way. The media doesn't cover a company until the flywheel is already spinning at 1,000 revolutions per minute. By then, it looks like an overnight success, like a sudden breakthrough, like magic. Consider Circuit City. On August 27, 1984, Forbes magazine published the first national-level profile of the company. It was just a 2-page article, but there it was, the first public acknowledgement that the company had broken through, an apparent overnight success story. What was the truth? This overnight success had been more than a decade in the making. Alan Wurtzel had inherited CEO responsibility from his father in 1973. With the firm close to bankruptcy, he rebuilt his executive team. he took an objective look at the brutal facts. He spent the next 4 years experimenting with a warehouse showroom style of retailing. In 1976, he started experimenting with consumer electronics in that format. In 1977, the first Circuit City store opened. In 1982, after 9 years of accumulated turns on the flywheel, the company committed fully to the superstore concept. Over the next 5 years, Circuit City generated the highest total return to shareholders of any company on the New York Stock Exchange. From 1982 to 1999, the company beat the general market 22 times. In the decade leading up to the transition, Collins's team found almost zero significant articles about Circuit City. In the decade after, 97 articles, 22 of them major features. As if the company hadn't even existed before, Collins uses the analogy of a chicken and an egg. Picture an egg just sitting there. Nobody pays much attention to it. Until one day, the egg cracks open and out jumps a chicken. All the magazines and newspapers jump on the story. The transformation of egg to chicken, stunning turnaround at egg, as if the egg had undergone some overnight metamorphosis. What does it look like from the chicken's point of view? Completely different. While the world was ignoring this dormant-looking egg, the chicken was evolving inside, growing, developing, incubating. From the chicken's point of view, cracking open the egg was just one more step in a long chain of steps. So Collins started asking the executives at these great companies, what did you call what you were doing? Did you have a name for the transformation? How did you talk about it at the time? The astounding answer? They didn't call it anything. There was no name, no launch event, no tagline, no programmatic feel whatsoever. Some executives said they weren't even aware that a major transformation was underway until they were well into it. It was often more obvious to them after the fact than at the time. The pattern Collins found held for every single great company. Some build-up phases were longer. Circuit City took 9 years, Nucor 10. Some were shorter, Gillette 5 years, Fannie Mae 3, Pitney Bowes only 2, but every single one of them followed the same basic process, accumulating momentum turn by turn, until build-up transformed into breakthrough. Now the opposite of the flywheel, the path the comparison companies took, Collins calls the doom loop. Consider Warner Lambert. In 1979, Warner Lambert told Businessweek they aimed to be a leading consumer products company. 1 year later, in 1980, they did an abrupt about-face. Now they were going after the pharmaceutical industry, trying to beat Merck, Lilly, and SmithKline. In 1981, they reversed course yet again and went back to consumer goods. 6 years later, in 1987, they did another U-turn and tried once more to be like Merck. In the early 1990s, they reversed yet again, back to consumer goods. Each new CEO brought a new program, halted the momentum of his predecessor, pushed the flywheel in a new direction, then stopped, pushed it somewhere else. From 1979 through 1998, Warner Lambert went through 3 major restructurings, one per CEO, hacking away 20,000 employees in search of quick breakthrough results, never building sustained momentum. Eventually, Warner Lambert disappeared, swallowed up by Pfizer. In a doom loop, every new push goes in a different direction. The flywheel never gets anywhere. The energy is spent, the momentum is lost, and the people lose their faith. What's interesting is that the great companies didn't try to create alignment or motivate the troops or manage change. They never had to. They just kept pushing the flywheel in the same direction. And after a while, the results began to speak for themselves. How do you get a company of 50,000 people, cashiers, baggers, shelf stockers, to embrace a radical new strategy that will change virtually every aspect of how the company operates? The Kroger CEO, Jim Herring, told Collins, "You don't. Not in one big event or program anyway. We presented what we were doing in such a way that people saw our accomplishments. We tried to bring our plans to successful conclusion step by step, so that the mass of people would gain confidence from the successes, not just the words. When you let the flywheel do the talking, you don't need to fervently communicate your goals. People extrapolate from the momentum for themselves. Hey, if we just keep doing this, look at where we can go. What do the right people want? More than almost anything else, they want to be part of a winning team. They want to contribute to producing visible, tangible results. They want to feel the excitement of being part of something that just flat out works. When the right people see a simple plan, born of confronting the brutal facts, developed from understanding rather than bravado, they say, "That'll work, count me in." When they see the dedication of level 5 leadership, they drop their cynicism. And when they begin to feel the magic of momentum, when they see the tangible results, when they feel the flywheel building speed, that's when the bulk of people throw their shoulders against the wheel and push. Alignment, motivation, and commitment are not things you create through inspiration. They are things that emerge from results. They follow momentum. They follow the flywheel. And once you've created sustained great results, once your company has truly gone from good to great, what comes next? Is greatness the end of the story, or is there one more level beyond it? It turns out there is. Chapter 8. From Great to Enduring Great. 6 years before he wrote Good to Great, Jim Collins had written another book, Built to Last. That book asked a different question. What does it take to start and build an enduring great company from the ground up? Collins and his co-author studied 18 iconic companies. Procter & Gamble, founded in 1837, American Express, founded in 1850, Johnson & Johnson, 1886, GE, 1892. So when Collins finished his research on going from good to great, he stood back and asked himself, how do these two studies relate? What he discovered surprised him. Good to Great, he now realized, was not a sequel to Built to Last. It was a prequel. Apply the findings in Good to Great to create sustained results, and then apply the findings in Built to Last to take those results and turn them into something that endures for generations. What's the additional ingredient? Collins calls it core ideology, core values, plus a core purpose that goes beyond just making money. A reason for being. Consider Merck, the pharmaceutical giant. In the 1970s, Merck developed a drug that cured river blindness, a devastating disease that afflicted over 1 million people in remote villages, mostly in the Amazon basin. Parasitic worms would swarm through the eyes, causing total blindness. The people who had this disease had no money, none, so Merck did something extraordinary. They built a distribution system from scratch to get the drug to remote villages, and then they gave the drug away, free, to millions of people. Merck is not a charity. It is one of the most consistently profitable pharmaceutical companies in history. So why give away a life-saving drug? Because in 1950, George Merck II, son of the founder, set forth the company's philosophy in a single line. We try to remember that medicine is for the patient, not for the profits. The profits follow, and if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear. The better we have remembered it, the larger they have been. Profits and cash flow in an enduring great company become like blood and water to a healthy body. They are absolutely essential, but they are not the point. They are not why the body exists. That extra layer is what separates a great company from an enduring great company. You preserve the core. You stimulate progress. You keep the values fixed, but you change everything else, products, strategies, even entire business lines, as the world changes around you. And here's the final piece. Collins took an idea from Built to Last called the BHAG, short for Big Hairy Audacious Goal, a huge, daunting 10 or 20-year mountain to climb, like NASA's mission to put a man on the moon in the 1960s. A BHAG captures the imagination. It grabs people in the gut, but Collins had a problem. What is the difference between a good BHAG and a bad one? The answer he now realized comes from this study. Bad BHAGs are set with bravado. Good BHAGs are set with understanding. Consider Boeing in 1952. At the time, Boeing built huge bombers for the military. The B-17, the B-29, the B-52. They had virtually no presence in the commercial aircraft market, and the airline showed no interest. "You make great bombers up there in Seattle," the airline said. "Why don't you just stick with that?" But Boeing's leader, Bill Allen, looked at the three circles. Could Boeing become the best commercial plane maker in the world? Not a decade earlier. But now, after years of building massive military jets, the cumulative experience made it possible. Would the economics be better than the military market? Yes, by a long way. Were the Boeing people passionate about building commercial jets? Absolutely. So in 1952, Allen and his team made a bold decision. They committed a quarter of the company's entire net worth, 25% of everything Boeing had, to build a prototype commercial jet. They built the 707, and they launched Boeing's bid to become the leading commercial aircraft maker in the world. 3 decades later, after producing 5 of the most successful commercial jets in history, the 707, 727, 737, 747, and 757, Boeing stood as the absolute, unquestioned greatest commercial airplane company in the world. But notice, the BHAG wasn't a random shot in the dark. It was massive and daunting, yes, but it sat squarely inside Boeing's 3 circles. The audacity matched the understanding. To remain great over time requires staying squarely within your 3 circles, while being willing to change the specific manifestation of what's inside those circles as the world changes around you. And that finally brings us back to the question we started with. Why bother with any of this? Why try for greatness at all? Let me bring all of this together, because what Collins really discovered after 5 years of research and 10.5 person-years of effort was something much simpler than anyone expected. There is no single secret to greatness. There is no one big push. There is no magic moment. There is no killer strategy. There is no celebrity savior who rides in from the outside and transforms everything. There is only a sequence of disciplines, held consistently, over a long period of time. It starts with level 5 leaders, quiet people, ambitious for the company, not themselves, plow horses, not show horses. They get the right people on the bus before they decide where to drive it. They confront the brutal facts of their current reality, while maintaining unwavering faith they will prevail in the end. They search, often for years, until they find the simple intersection of 3 circles, what they can be the best at, what drives their economic engine, what they are deeply passionate about. They build a culture of discipline around that hedgehog concept. They use technology not as a savior, but as an accelerator, and they push the flywheel, turn by turn, year by year, until breakthrough. That's the whole framework. That's the entire book in one paragraph. And here's the part that should change how you think about your own work. Collins says, and his research bears this out, that going from good to great is not harder than staying mediocre. It is no more exhausting. It involves no more suffering. In fact, the comparison companies in this study, the ones that stayed merely good or slid into decline, actually suffered more than the great ones. They lurched, they restructured, they changed direction every few years, they laid off people in waves. The great companies didn't do any of that. They just kept pushing the flywheel. Greatness, it turns out, is not a function of circumstance. Greatness is largely a matter of conscious choice and discipline. Now I want to leave you with one final story. Because of all the examples in this book, this one is the one that stayed with me longest. Near the end of the book, Collins tells the story of a high school cross-country running team. The team had transformed in 5 years from good, top 20 in their state, to great, state champions 2 years in a row, both boys and girls teams. One of the coaches asked, "I don't get it. Why are we so successful? We don't work harder than other teams, and what we do is just so simple. Why does it work?" The team had built itself around a single hedgehog concept. 5 words. We run best at the end. We run best at the end of workouts. We run best at the end of races. We run best at the end of the season. Everything in the program is geared to that single idea. While most teams collect time splits during races, how fast each kid is running, this team collects place splits, what position each runner is in at the 2-mile mark of a 3-mile race. Then they calculate not how fast their kids ran, but how many competitors they passed at the end. They reward runners with what they call head bones, beads in the shape of shrunken skulls, symbolizing the competitors they vanquished by finishing strong. The kids learn to pace themselves. They learn to race with confidence. When they hit the back half of a race, even when their legs are burning, they think to themselves, "We run best at the end, so if I'm hurting bad, my competitors must be hurting a whole lot worse." And what didn't the team do? When the head coach took over, she was expected to do fun programs, motivational events, shopping trips to Nike outlets, inspirational speeches. She quietly killed almost all of it. "Look," she said, "this program will be built on the idea that running is fun, racing is fun, improving is fun, and winning is fun. If you're not passionate about what we do here, then go find something else to do." She didn't try to motivate the kids to win state. She just let them gain momentum, race by race, week by week. They saw for themselves that they could beat anyone. Then one day, out on a training run, one boy turned to his teammates and said, "Hey, I think we could win state." "Yeah," another said. "I think so too." Everyone kept running. The goal quietly understood. The coaches never once mentioned a state championship until the kids saw for themselves that they could do it. The night before the state race, one team member called every single one of his teammates, just to make sure they were getting to bed early. No coaches required. The discipline was theirs. The commitment was theirs. They won state by a large margin. Now here's the most interesting twist of all. The head coach has an MBA from an elite business school, Phi Beta Kappa in economics. She won the prize for the best undergraduate honors thesis at one of the most selective universities in the world. Most of her classmates went on to Wall Street, investment banking, internet startups, consulting. She didn't want any of it, not because she lacked ambition, because she wanted her work to mean something. When Collins asked her why she felt compelled to make her cross-country program great, she paused. "That's a really good question. It's really hard to answer." Long paused. "I guess it's because I really care about what we're doing. I believe in running and the impact it can make on these kids' lives. I want them to have a great experience, to be part of something absolutely first class. If you're doing something you care that much about, and you believe in its purpose deeply enough, then the question, why try for greatness, answers itself. It's just a given. So the real question is not why greatness. The real question is, what work would make you feel compelled to try to create greatness? Maybe your quest to be part of something great will not happen in your business life. Maybe it won't happen in a corporation at all. Maybe it'll be in your church, a nonprofit, a community organization, a class you teach, a team you coach, a family you build. Get involved in something you care so much about that you want to make it the greatest it can possibly be. Not because of what you'll get, just because it can be done. When you do this, you will start to grow inevitably toward becoming a level 5 leader, toward developing the discipline to confront the brutal facts, toward the patience to push the flywheel, toward the clarity to find your own 3 circles. Because in the end, it is impossible to have a great life unless it is a meaningful life. And it is very difficult to have a meaningful life without meaningful work. So when you turn this off, ask yourself one question, the one Collins asked the cross-country coach, the one she paused so long to answer. What work do you care about so deeply that you cannot imagine not trying to make it great? Find that work, whatever it is, and then start pushing the flywheel. Today, tomorrow, next year, and the year after that. Because Darwin Smith was not born a level 5 leader. Joe Coleman was not born lucky. Walgreens was not born great. They became these things, one quiet turn of the flywheel at a time. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, you're someone who's thinking about how to build something that lasts. So here's what I want to know in the comments. What is the brutal fact you're avoiding right now in your work or in your life? The thing you can see clearly but haven't been willing to confront. Colin says no good decision can be made until you face it. So name it, even just to yourself. That's where the flywheel starts. If you've never read Good to Great in full, the audiobook on Audible is one of the best business books ever recorded. The stories I told you tonight are just the surface. The full book has dozens more. I'll link it below if you want it. And if this video gave you something useful, and you want more deep dives like this on the biggest ideas from the most important books ever written, subscribe to the channel. There's more coming. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.